will now hear a major campaign address by the only combat veteran and labor man running for Congress, Mr. M.H. Mike Ross of Greensboro, Progressive Party candidate for Congress in the 6th District. Mr. M.H. Ross.
4 years ago, millions of us in foxholes or on farms or in city precincts voted to return our friend and leader, Franklin Roosevelt, to the presidency. In April 1945, they buried our president in Hyde Park, and then the two old parties buried the New Deal in Washington. Herbert Hoover, who had been kept out of Washington for 12 years, was invited by Truman to the White House. The banking house boys, the all-well diplomats, and the big brass generals took over, and they did a pretty good job of tearing down most of what Roosevelt had patiently built up over 12 years. The bipartisan war drive is being exposed every day for what it really is, a plan by Wall Street interests to control the world.
I've been all over the United States, speaking and attempting to speak, and I have been experiencing in our own country today this very thing of control over the people through fear, terrorism, and brutality. This is happening in all parts of this land.
When they were aligned with the Nazis, their goal is the overthrow of our government. There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia, not the United States. Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting the nation.
Hello, and welcome to A People's History of Violence, the podcast where we do entirely two deep dives into history's crimes, coups, conspiracies, cover-ups, assassinations, affairs, trials, and terrors. And I'll say that every time until someone stops me. I'm your co-host, Isaac.
And I'm your co-host, Peter. And the last...
Oh, yeah. What are we talking about today?
Yeah, well, we've been talking about the Rosenberg case, the famous conspiracy to commit espionage trial that helped kick off the American side of the Cold War. And for the last two episodes, we've been talking about the context of the actual deeds that were committed that led to the arrest and trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and of Morton Sobel. And now we're going to get into the actual arrest.
Right, because last time we left off, we were still in 1945, and David was a somewhat ineffectual, if well-meaning, wannabe spy, sending letters back and forth with his wife, talking about the socialist future he imagined would be coming in the future, and that Julius and Ethel also imagined becoming the future. And it's tough to see just from that perspective how this whole thing gets turned upside down and things become very dark on this episode. Listeners, I'll put it that way. And David goes from being this kind of wannabe spy into a kind of smiling, rictus grinning, pathological liar who's sending his in-laws to the electric chair.
This is the moment in the Coen Brothers movie where it goes from being silly and a little bit dark to being mostly dark, but with still some moments of quite dark humor. You know, we see a flip. The flip comes with the end of the Second World War, the decline of the hopes for the sort of world that the Rosenbergs and the Greenglasses and various other progressives in the United States hoped to see coming out of the defeat of fascism in an altogether different world asserting itself and defining the post-war order, along with the fates of the Rosenbergs.
Yeah, it's almost instructive in some ways to think back to 1944 on D-Day, because we have this idea that was this purely in the patriotic continuity of things. We don't see kind of communists or people in this broader communist movement who don't want to be necessarily subject to party discipline, but are sympathetic to the goal of building a socialist world, right? As being part of that. But it was funny, while doing research on this, I found that at this kind of early morning hours on D-Day, in one location you had J.D. Bernal, the British scientist who had actually done intensive research on the particular grade of sand that was on the beach to make sure that they could actually put vehicles on there. And he was the one who actually conceptualized this whole invasion as happening at Normandy Beach, where it ultimately did happen.
Because they thought it was going to be at Calais or somewhere else.
Right. And he, having visited there, had surveyed this site and had advocated for it. And he was a thoroughgoing British communist. He wanted the British to win this one. And at the same time, at General Electric in New York, you had Morton Sobel, the only employee of his whole group, according to later FBI files, booming a transistor radio that was giving updates from CBS News or whatever of the D-Day invasion, sitting there cheering it on like it was a Dodgers game. And it's remarkable to think how much the world changed, considering these people thought in kind of the popular front vein of socialist standing and communist standing shoulder to shoulder in the march for democracy and so on, even if they had totally misread the character of the Soviet Union. They thought that they were on the march, that these contradictions would all work themselves out. People had other plans in the American government and other places.
Yeah, and in a lot of respects, what we're talking about here today, and arguably in this whole series, is about the transition from that world to the world of the Cold War that ultimately gave birth to the world that we live in. D-Day here, we talk about people who are on the ground, and it's going to be a group of people, many of whom got involved in this organization quite specifically to not be on the ground in places like D-Day or Guadalcanal that are some of the prime actors in what goes on here. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the way I kind of like to conceptualize this period, because in this episode we're really going to cover this period from like 1945 to 1950 in the lives of this group of characters. We have a notion that the Cold War and anti-communism and the Red Scare all came about as this kind of like hysteria that people's psychologies were affected, when actually it was like a series of ignitions before the fire actually caught on. And one of the groups and people behind this ignitions, of course, was J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, and I hope to go into maybe more detail with this in a kind of a bonus episode or something like that, but J. Edgar Hoover, let's say, was not just right-wing, but rather fascist sympathetic for all of his career. He was particularly concerned about the Jews, especially American Jews, as a group and their susceptibility to, in his view, the infection of communism. And even though we've talked about how Jewish people on the Lower East Side were disproportionately sympathetic to communism, it's not like American Jews as a whole were sympathetic or joined the Communist Party, which was a very, very small party. But yeah, more than usual cycled in. You could say that of a lot of other groups. With J. Edgar Hoover, though, it was an obsessive focus. And in addition to that, he was an extreme anti-socialist. He didn't believe labor unions should be organizing in the way that they were during the 1930s and 40s. And he saw that as a threat to American democracy and American war readiness come to it. But before there was even a victory in World War II, just 2 months after VE Day, the defeat of the Nazis, J. Edgar Hoover sent out a memorandum himself to the FBI saying that they needed to start investigating and drawing up charges against the Communist Party and the Communist movement as a movement on criminal conspiracy. They needed to go find out how they could basically round these people up and put them in prison for a crime.
So I can give my segue. I had a pretty good segue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do your segue.
I'm going to do my segue. One of the things that Hoover helped instantiate into the federal government is the idea of communism and essentially any politics to the left of, say, the most conservative Democrats at the time, was essentially the idea that they were all in it together. The idea of this monolithic communist conspiracy directed from Moscow.
Right.
And that it operated the same way everywhere you go, all over the world, with a singular goal.
Yeah.
And it turned out that there were other law enforcement bodies in the Western democracies that were thinking much the same thing and kind of cooperating towards instantiating this viewpoint as a semi-official dogma.
Right. In other words, I think we have a kind of idea that Hoover and the FBI act as kind of just bureaucratic actors. They try to enlarge their agency. They try to get a little bit of appropriations here and there. When actually he's very much a political actor who is using his bureaucracy to advance the agenda, and others are as well.
Yeah.
They know that they have this tool, and other military leaders, industrialists, and so on know that they have these tools, and they try to use them. Probably the first instance of this, I think, is the RCMP in Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, who it turns out are not completely Dudley Do-Right people. They're also Canada's national police and national intelligence agency.
Or they were until 9/11. Now they made CSIS, the Canadian spy agency. I once watched a very boring TV show about them, but they covered a lot. They had a lot on their plate, and still do, including beating the shit out of anyone who objects to seizing First Nations land and water rights.
Yeah. So in 1945, just days after the surrender of Japan, a case arises, an entire spy scandal that I like to think of, and I think our listeners should take note here, as a kind of mini Red Scare, a mini demonstration of what Hoover and the right actually want to do at a larger scale in the US. And this is called the Gouzenko Affair. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that for our Russian-speaking members of the audience, but that's unfortunately what's just going to happen. So Igor Gouzenko was a cryptography clerk. So he sends and receives and translates messages that are sent in cryptographic code from the Russian embassy there in Ottawa, where he is actually assigned as kind of an NKGB attaché. From the Soviet intelligence agency there in Ottawa. And a couple of days after the surrender of Japan, Gouzenko goes and, in his own account, because he has seen Canadian freedom and liberty, runs out with 110 super incriminating documents or files from that KGB detachment, and goes to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and delivers them the goods and pleads for asylum and protection after being rejected when he originally tried to go to a newspaper and hiding from KGB agents and so forth. You might detect a note of skepticism here, and I've talked to Peter about this a couple of times, but I don't think that Gouzenko's account makes too much sense, in large part.
What about Gouzenko's account doesn't make? What did he say, and why doesn't it make sense?
So the reason I don't think it makes sense is why he leaves in the time he leaves, right? Why he supposedly leaves is because in his account he just decided that he might be getting transferred. He says he later on that he made a few mistakes, and that if he gets sent back to Moscow, now that the war is over, he might be facing being sent to the Gulag or even executed, which is not something that typically happens, frankly, even in crazy Stalinist Soviet Union if you make mistakes. But more tellingly, for someone who makes mistakes, air quotes, is that he knows to go ahead and steal these files from the attaché. And there's actually an inkling of what was really going on that came out in this kind of semi-memoir of a British intelligence agent. I think I wrote the guy's name down. That British intelligence agent was in fact the very famous Sir William Stevenson, aka Intrepid. In any case, Gouzenko actually had already put out feelers and contacted a British intelligence agent who was stationed in Canada at the time by his own account and arranged for his defection. And that's why probably a better way to see this is Gouzenko had been passing along information from the Soviet embassy to handlers, maybe just tidbits of information, or maybe he had just been giving like hints that he wanted to defect and had some information. And then when he found out that he was going to be replaced, which we now know is the case, there was a replacement being sent from Moscow to take over Gouzenko's job, he stole as many documents as possible and then went to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, noting that he could trade intelligence documents for protection, money, his life.
So what did the RCMP do with the documents that they got?
So that's the even crazier part here, is the RCMP took these 110 documents, which to my knowledge have actually still not been fully declassified. So we still don't know exactly what's in them, and use them to build cases against a whole host of members of Canadian society and British society too, from scientists like Alan Nunn May to a member of Parliament, Fred Rose. And in the initial kind of panic stages of this, the RCMP got a War Measures Act directive from the Prime Minister that allowed them to go ahead and just search people's homes and arrest them and hold them incommunicado. No one could visit them, no one could see what was going on. Was basically a black site that the Mounties controlled in Canada. And that, I believe, was between, it was just under 24 people that they did that to.
And they were being accused of espionage.
They were being accused
on behalf of the Soviet Union.
By and large, yes. Although the actual, the substance of the espionage and the substance of Gouzenko's charges was never fully disclosed to them as they were going through these really kind of kangaroo trials, the wrong word, but not actually fair trials that they were put through. In Fred Rose's case, and Fred Rose was actually a Jewish communist movement or communist affiliated MP. He was on, I think it was the Canadian Farmer Labour Party ticket in Quebec. Fred Rose had campaigned against Quebec's openly fascist collaborating government before and during World War II, and was respected as a believer not just in Commonwealth socialism. He proposed the first single-payer healthcare system in a bill in the Canadian Parliament, but also is standing and fighting against fascism at a time when it was very brave to do so in that region of Canada.
Oh yeah. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this was what Isaac's referring to is the reign of Maurice Duplessis, who was the premier of Quebec for many, many years, between the 30s and I think the 50s. He had a regime that some scholars of fascism who are generally pretty circumspect with what they call fascist and what they don't.
They don't like to use that term lightly.
Loosely. No, refer to as a kind of clerical fascism. This was a sort of fascism you'd see largely in Catholic countries where it was sort of authoritarianism aided by church social structures. So the Catholic Church, traditionally very powerful in Quebec, and Duplessis more or less ran in an internal fascist state with the kind of assent from the Anglo-Canadian rulers of Canada, who always sort of thought, all right, let's let the Frenchies take care of themselves as long as they're not causing us problems. And Duplessis, by and large, did not cause them problems, but caused a lot of problems for anyone in Quebec trying to organize a labor union or do anything different from what the Catholic Church wanted, or oppose him politically. So it took a lot of there's also a substantial...
And no doubt with a healthy dose of repression towards anyone who was like a trade unionist or trying to raise wages or get benefits.
Yeah, and there was a substantial working class population, especially in Montreal, substantial Jewish population as well. So it took a good deal of courage from people from that community and from the larger community. So what happens?
And I guess the interesting aspect of this is that someone whose beliefs and actions at the time are anti-fascist and are considered in the mainstream of fighting for democracy and equality for people And yeah, his constituency was that Jewish and working class part of Montreal. Now his actions are anti-patriotic, treasonous, and put him in jail. He actually had to flee to Poland and just kind of eked out an existence there, trying to get back his Canadian citizenship in return, but he couldn't. And it's interesting to kind of compare that with at the same time that he was put on trial in 1946 in the United States. This guy named O. John Rogge, who will play a big part later in our story because he becomes David Greenglass' lawyer. He is a Department of Justice prosecutor, and he went to Germany, spoke with the Nuremberg prosecutors, and got reams of evidence against members of the United States government and Congress, including and especially Burton K. Wheeler, showing that they had been involved in sending information and collaborating with the Nazis before and during the war. And this is met with complete silence, and his report was classified all the way until 1961, I want to say, when John F. Kennedy declassified.
Yeah, Wheeler, for those of you unfamiliar, he was a senator from Montana. So what happened to him? Nothing?
I mean, he lost his Senate seat, but that's about it. He certainly never got prosecuted for any of the Nazi stuff. But so to go back to this whole Gouzenko affair for a second, I think what we can see is kind of a model here where Gouzenko becomes kind of the perfect mouthpiece to just say, I know that such and such is a communist, I have the secret documents. He had the documents, folks.
Yeah. And that we still haven't seen.
Yeah, I think I showed you a picture of Gouzenko because he never actually shows his face. He continuously wears a bag over his head, which I guess is something that shows you that this was a Canadian context, because if you wear a bag over your head in the U.S., you look a little bit at least like a Klansman.
Yeah, certain other implications.
But later on, he actually accuses Pierre Trudeau of being a communist. He accuses Lester Pearson, wasn't he a conservative? Of being a communist. Sues everyone who tries to impugn his reputation in any way. And basically he becomes the perfect manipulable pawn of a witness, and kind of a model going forward with it for the kind of witnesses that the FBI and others want. You know, able to give a very fantastic story, able to claim kind of secret knowledge of communist doings and stuff like that.
And the general communist plan,
right? As
though he would necessarily be privy to the thoughts of the Politburo.
He, a co-clerk, is privy to Stalin and Beria's and others' inner thoughts. But he did claim that. So the RCMP had him make a statement on October 6th of 1945. So literally, the ruins have not stopped smoking from the anti-fascist war of World War II. And he makes a statement saying that the Westerners have been deceived. The communist parties are all pawns for Moscow, and Moscow has never given up on its plans to subject the entire world to a world dictatorship. It looks like it's been written by like a polished American right-wing publicity rag like Time Magazine, Look, or something like that. The language reads exactly the same, but this is released for public consumption. Of course, in the meantime, and I say this to some extent to kind of back up why I just am suspicious about Gouzenko's story. A guy named William Rubin compiled a whole series of quotes about Gouzenko that have been put out in the literature, and especially by a book by a guy named Sawatsky called Gouzenko, The Untold Story by John Sawatsky, in which various people who knew Gouzenko well, mostly the RCMP agents and so on who were sent to guard Gouzenko on his retreats, his kind of farms that the KGB can never get to him, describe him as a, quote, son of a bitch, a scoundrel, a bit of a nutcase, which we've already seen, who is money-grubbing, thoroughly unreliable, a spoiled brat, a cheat, incapable of writing anything by himself, who stiffed his ghostwriters, and a lawyer a very conservative lawyer, this was kind of a right-wing nut himself, who raised more than $67,000 from anonymous sources to essentially help Gouzenko pay off his debts, called him, quote, a plain son of a bitch, a cheat from the word go, and as greedy as anyone you'd ever know, which I can say now because he's dead.
Right.
But yeah, basically this first attempt at creating an espionage communist conspiracy scare in Canada Didn't have the effect, however, of getting the public really hardcore on its side. In fact, in particular with the case of one of the scientists that was implicated by Gouzenko, a guy named Alan Nunn-May, who Gouzenko's documents kind of revealed had been passing along atomic secrets, unlike David Greenglass's actual good atomic intelligence to the Soviets. When his name got in the press, this was still 1946. Loads of people still saw the Soviet Union as an ally, still saw this thing as a common struggle, and maybe now we're building a United Nations or United World, even if people in government, and especially not people on the right, thought so. And so the public reaction to the Alan Nunn-May indictment, because he was criminally indicted in England after Gouzenko came out and implicated him, was among places in like the February edition of the 1946 New York Times, February 18th, Professor J.D. Bernal, one of Britain's most eminent scientists, said that the espionage conspiracy uncovered in Canada was a direct result of the reluctance to share atomic secrets and scientific information generally. The U.S.'s ex-ambassador to the Soviet Union says the Soviets have the right to spy in this case.
Would that have been Harriman or?
Davies.
Davies, okay.
Russia, in self-defense, has every moral right to seek atomic bomb secrets through military espionage if excluded from such information by her former allies. Such exclusion is by inference hostile. And Davies, again, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, well, former, if Russia had developed the atomic bomb and the United States were in her shoes, we certainly would try to obtain such information, especially if we faced a potentially hostile world. In other words, the initial reaction to all of this, oh, we found spies and they're communists, it turned out some communists went on to spy, was by and large not, we need to shut down the Communist Party and ban it, but a really hard reaction, at least from this intellectual elite, of no, they did what they had to do. Right. They're good people.
Or it's just like it's how the game is played, basically.
At least with Alan Nunn-May, for his part, he didn't apologize for what he did. He said he thought that he was contributing to the future of humanity and preventing the destruction of humanity by sharing atomic secrets, which is what Niels Bohr, as we talked about in the last episode, also believed.
And while all this was happening, what was the Soviet intelligence apparatus in the U.S. up to?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing is after the Gouzenko releases, after all these implications from these files come out, the Soviet apparatus, and you would never know this if you were living in the heady days of the Cold War United States, Soviet spy apparatus shut down. It went completely on ice. And they cut off contacts with people like Julius Rosenberg, David Greenglass, Warren Sobel. Everyone was cut off. They were understandably concerned that they didn't know how far the chain of connection would go. And they certainly didn't want potentially to not just have their own activities exposed, but have this to be used to roll up communist movements in the center of world capitalism in the United States. But one of the things that happens after the Soviets put everything on ice and cut contact is David Greenglass, who in September of 1945 was assigned by Alexei, which is Anatoly Yakovlev, to collect materials, just has uranium and plutonium sitting in his closet in his tiny little tenement apartment. And plutonium is a very valuable substance and also extremely poisonous.
Right. I was going to say, did he get cancer?
No. He knew enough about the radiation. He put the plutonium in a lead box. There's actually a report from the Soviets in August 2nd of 1948. And I'll just say their names rather than the code names. Julius Rosenberg also reported that for quite some time, David had kept a small amount of plutonium in a lead box, but that on Julius' instructions, he had thrown it into the river. So for our most intrepid listeners, your assignment is there is physical evidence still in the Rosenberg case. It's a piece of plutonium in a lead box in the East River.
Yeah, I'm sure we have some diving enthusiasts. I'm sure the East River is a fascinating dive site.
Somehow, David was like, what do I do with these radioactive materials? And at one point finally mentioned to Julius, hey, I have plutonium and uranium in my closet. And Julius says, Jesus fucking Christ, and throws them in the East River.
Yeah, don't have that.
Don't have that.
You don't need to have that.
So they were shut down for a period of 2 years. So from about 1946 in reaction to Gouzenko all the way to 1948. And Gouzenko himself ends up being kind of a model for the FBI, at least, of where they may have made mistakes in creating this kind of communism expert and where they could improve. And they actually get one defector around the same time named Elizabeth Bentley, who becomes a witness at the Rosenberg trial, kind of an expert witness. And she's shopped around to all these anti-communist trials all over the country, along with people like Louis Boudin's, Whittaker Chambers, who just become professional anti-communist witness. And their stories become more and more elaborate, but they're all in the same vein as Gouzenko, saying that the communist apparatus is not a party. It's not a political movement. It's not something that people believe and organize around. It's a conspiracy.
Yeah. What strikes me, that whole story about the Soviets icing their own intelligence setup for multiple years, is the kind of emerging sense that is coming out of the historiography. And it's amazing. It goes to show how kind of, and there's good reasons for this, how slow the historical profession can be, right? It likes to march very carefully and gingerly towards the president. And B, how even among historians skeptical of the American side of the Cold War, how powerful Cold War narratives can be, which is that the Soviets were actually a very cautious power. They could clamp down hard in places where they felt they had really strong control, like within the borders of the Soviet Union, for instance, or in places like Hungary, eventually Afghanistan, though it didn't work out so well for them there. But when it came to the rest of the world, they were nervous. They didn't especially know that well what they were doing. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the access that the capitalist powers had, and they tended to play very cautiously. When you think about their history, the Soviet elite coming out of generations of persecution, first at the hands of the Tsarists, and then eventually at the hands of Stalin. Anyone poking their head up is going to get whacked. And B, the history of Russia in the 20th century getting ravaged by these wars, that they're a cautious bunch. They're
extremely, like, well, what's the word?
Gun shy.
They're very tight players. Yeah. But they don't make gambles you don't want to make, a big mistake and burn a spy network or something like that. And it's the complete opposite picture that you would get if you were living in the US at the time. But doing kind of reading on, I've always been taught kind of like in high school history classes and even just anywhere, that basically you go from World War II to economic boom. That there was a transition where everyone was afraid that something would happen, but nothing bad economically happened. And I always find that kind of hard to square in this case with how much Julius and David and Bernie Greenglass all struggled to try to make first one machine shop, one business, and then another. It turns out that this kind of 5 year, basically before the Korean War, the U.S. economy was a very uncertain place. We had this kind of semi-socialist economy directed by the War Production Board. And nevertheless, all of the same capitalist actors, the heads of companies like Ford and General Motors and GE, were left in power. So as soon as the war was over, they pushed as hard as they possibly could, paying congressional campaigns, campaigning the public, saying that free enterprise had won the war. Eric Foner pointed that out, to try to roll back any kind of government control, to get rid of War Production Board, get rid of price administration, and get rid of any labor regulations that were instituted as part of the war effort. In spite of all these dreams for how the world was going to be run after the war that we talked about in episode 1 and episode 2, mentioned there's this incredibly well-funded operation, Take Back the Congress, in 1946. That's where Richard Nixon first gets elected and starts a meteoric rise to power as an anti-communist. And basically this Congress has two overriding issues, which is one, to wage war on communism abroad. So they start funding the kind of neo-royalist and quasi-fascist forces in Greece and in Italy and other places. And two, waging war on anything communist adjacent at home, which they classify as anything that fetters free enterprise, capitalism, and so on. So out of this Congress, you have no national housing program, which people thought was going to happen, no national health program. And instead, you have something like Taft-Hartley, which severely restricts what trade unions in the United States can do.
And it's worth knowing that I know Truman was in favor of a national health care, single payer, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah, it would have been national health insurance.
Right, and he vetoed Taft-Hartley when it came to his desk, but the Republicans were able to pass it. And presumably,
they overrode his veto with the two.
Right, my guess is with help from some Democrats.
From the Southern Democrats, the literally racist Jim Crow Democrat. Prior to the Republicans taking over, they thought they were going to be able to pass what essentially would have been a kind of national control, or at least indicative planning of the economy with the Full Employment Act.
Right.
Where if the economy was not at full employment, the government had an obligation to get people jobs and to create public work such that people have jobs.
Right.
We think of this as only having this kind of like broad statistical impact, but the interesting aspect here is that you can see how this transition from the wartime era where Julius is employed, Ruth Greenglass is employed, doing government work, typing work, David's employed, to this new era where they're kind of all on their own, and Julius has to become a brave entrepreneur in this definitely not even social democratic society.
Well, that's what we want, right? We want people to be brave entrepreneurs. That's the best society you can have.
Yeah, America, you're on your own. Maybe this is a good point as any to kind of revisit where our characters in the story are from when we left them off in 1945. Julius had been fired not just from spy work, but also from his job with the Signal Corps. He did get another job doing like radio company work. David Greenglass gets discharged from the Army and from the Manhattan Project in 46. And David, Julius, and David Greenglass's brother, Bernie Greenglass, actually all found a machine shop and go into the private economy.
How did it do for Julian's machine shop?
So to elaborate on the whole machine shop, how this business worked, one, he had to do it twice. First, they founded GNR Engineering or GNR Machine Tools. That business went under, and they kind of recapitalized and refounded the company as the Pitt Machine Tool Company. And David Greenglass, he didn't have the engineering degree that Julius did. He never completed college. He just was able to do some night classes, failed courses. He didn't have the kind of like economic wherewithal that Julius did, but he put up almost all of his savings into this business and became a shareholder along with his brother Bernie. And Julius kind of acted as the business agent, the go-between who would bring in the business, bring in the jobs, which involved trying to make machine parts for larger industrial concerns in New York City and elsewhere. And Julius would try to solicit business from friends. He would try to solicit business from old CCNY classmates, kind of like how he did as a recruiter when he was recruiting people to give industrial secrets. Like his talking to people is actually the thing Julius was good at.
Yeah.
Engineering, according to, previously good friend of his, Morty Sobel, was not his strong suit. What he could do is have a vision for things. But when they brought in these contracts, due to the kind of like the low capitalization of the company, they often found that they weren't able to fill them too well. There's varying reports on this, and I don't mean to claim like a certain knowledge of what happened in this whole business concern. But it seems like what occurred was frequently Julius would be able to rope in some business, rope in a contract. It would be well beyond the capacity of their little shop to do. They would either have to farm it out to other shops, try to subcontract, or they just couldn't fulfill the contract because they didn't actually have the machine tools because they couldn't afford them. And you can kind of see how, particularly with as kind of a nervous and strange a character as David Greenglass, that this shop, this business, rapidly becomes kind of a financial prison for him.
Right. Because he's providing a fair amount of the capital.
Well, he certainly did provide it.
Yeah.
To kind of pick up with what we were saying about this business and David Greenglass' situation, Julius doesn't actually have money himself. He's actually not wealthy
Right.
at all. When David actually goes to Julius requesting money for things like birth of a child, a funeral expense, because he doesn't have any money, and the money that he did have is tied up in the machine shop. Julius himself doesn't have the money and ends up having to call a friend. What does Julius usually do? He calls an old CCNY classmate,
Right.
William Pearl, who actually did manage to get some success after the war amid the kind of growing international industrial business concerns that he could be a part of. Yeah, he was working at one point on, I believe, the Aswan Dam in Egypt.
Oh, wow.
Under Nasser, and was able to front some money to Julius, who then was able to kind of give David these bits of cash. But Julius at the time, and frankly also David at the time, started to see it as blackmail. That David would reveal that about Julius. So that the threat being that David would potentially unmask Julius. Although it's kind of hard for me to see how David could have implicated Julius without bringing himself down.
Right. Well, people often don't think that far ahead, these situations with, these mutual standoffs. I was going to say, how did David take all this sort of, psychologically? He doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would.
Yeah, I mean, probably one of the most vivid descriptions is the one he gives later on to the grand jury. So in 1950, he's talking about how back in 1948 at this machine shop, he's doing the main actual manual labor at the shop, and many weeks he's not taking home a paycheck. He's coming home to his wife, I believe possibly pregnant at the time, but in any case, they're coming home to this not nice post-war public housing like they thought they would come home to in the social democratic or even communist world that they were building, but the same rundown cold water flat with no paycheck. Having tied up the savings in this concern, he runs up thousands of dollars in debt, and not for like some vice like drinking or gambling or anything like that. He runs up debt for necessities. And in 1949, or the winter of 1949, by some accounts, this is where he suffers what Ethel Rosenberg, his older sister, calls a psychological heart attack.
Oof.
And his own wife later describes him as having these kind of nervous breakdowns at the time where he takes off some of his clothes and runs through the halls of their building, talking about elephants and lead pants.
Okay. Yeah, that's not good.
So the walls for David definitely were closing in at this time, financially, psychologically, and everything. And it's the FBI comes knocking on his door to ask about anything.
Right.
So this newly elected right-wing Congress really tries to make the most of its 2 years of mandate, right? And one of the first things they do is and these are recounted in other places, but they hold highly, highly publicized congressional hearings like the Hollywood 10 hearings, or the hearings on Hollywood that result in the Hollywood 10 case, where they bring up people and ask them if they know about this or that associate of theirs, whether he's a communist, whether they're a communist, whether they were trying to inculcate propaganda into the American public. And you have contempt hearings that arise out of this. So if you refuse to testify, the Congress would then hold you in contempt, charge you with a crime of refusing to testify, and then potentially be in prison. But I feel the much more significant prosecutions were the Smith Act prosecutions of the Communist Party leaders. Because essentially these are the fulfillment of the plan that J. Edgar Hoover had asked his own bureau in the Justice Department to draw up in 1945. where he said, we're going to drop a case where the Communist Party is itself treated like a criminal conspiracy, and therefore its members can just be put in prison.
Yeah, I feel like everybody's heard of the the Hollywood blacklist and everything like that, but you don't hear so much about the Smith Acts. So can you break down what the Smith Act was?
Yeah, and I think the Smith Act trials would probably take up itself a whole another series of episodes, but just to kind of summarize what was going on here a bit is it was by using a legal means in terms of arrest, prosecution, imprisonment, or arrest and prosecution, trial and imprisonment to obtain the same result as you would if you were just, a Mussolini or a Franco type regime, which is someone's an active communist, put them in prison.
Right.
And so the Smith Act, in its definition, it was originally used to try to stop fascist subversion, things like the Christian Front, to put them.
Right.
The Smith Act prohibits advocacy or teaching, or the conspiracy to advocate or teach the overthrow of the government or the U.S. constitutional system by force or violence. They imprison about a dozen or more of the upper leadership of the Communist Party of the United States. Many cases of this, Junius Scales, Ben Davis, who was the councilman from Harlem, and a good friend of Paul Robeson. The basis of the prosecution is the Communist Party, by advocating revolutionary change of the capitalist system or the United States government, by definition was advocating the use of force or violence against the United States government. And the way that they pursued this was the FBI would bring in a stable of these Gouzenko clone type witnesses. So they're all kind of very vulnerable witnesses to be the plaything of FBI, and they're happy to testify, oh yes, the Communist Party is this, it is a conspiracy teaching the overthrow of the United States government, infiltrating it by force and violence. You could see how the temperature is just stoked and rises steadily.
Yeah, and we also see at least a little bit of, and this might help contrast sort of the American case, how Cold War fever hits America in a way that it doesn't for a while with Canada, Britain, similar peer democracies, is the mobilization of popular anger that is primarily against minority groups, but can be turned to anti-communism, which in turn becomes anti-anything progressive in events like the Peekskill riot, that we see in 1949, which was a series of clashes in a town in Westchester County, New York, around a concert put on by Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, probably one of the most talented American singers and actors of throughout American history. He was, a huge star. He was black. He didn't like those sort of roles he could get in Hollywood, so he primarily stuck to singing and theatrical theater performances in London and elsewhere. And he was, by 1949, an increasingly political star. He was he a communist? Was he a full member of the Communist Party?
So he never admitted being a member of the Communist Party. And just to kind of catch the thread that you're putting out there. So Paul Robeson, I guess you could always classify him as a fellow traveler. He never said that. Paul Robeson never admitted membership in the Communist Party, but he openly defended members of the Communist Party. He said that, no, I see the struggle for communism as just being a part of the same popular struggle to take control of the wealth and the power of this country from the few wealthy people and restore it to the many. He said, I see the struggle of communism and socialism and democracy as one and the same.
And anti-colonialism.
And anti-colonialism and anti-racism as part of the same struggle.
This angered many people.
This extremely angered people. And in particular, one well-publicized remark was one that he made at, I believe, a World Peace Congress, and also in Beijing, 1949, in which he said that in any future war, if the U.S. were called to fight against the Soviet Union, then African Americans would not take up arms against the Soviet Union. That they could, in other words, that people can be rest assured that the U.S. government might declare a war against the Soviet Union, but those who have been victimized by the United States aren't going to pick up the guns and actually fight it.
Which they did in numbers in World War II,
right.
Encouraged by civil rights leaders, and by, I'm pretty sure Robeson would have signed off on this as a double V campaign, the idea of there being a double victory over fascism abroad and Jim Crow at home.
Right.
That participation in the war would help defeat Jim Crow.
And Robeson, of course, was not just an incredible and eloquent speaker, but also an incredible singer. He was an attorney. He was a campaigner for any number of causes. And in the case of the concert that this Peekskill riot arose out of, he was campaigning and raising funds for the Civil Rights Congress. The Civil Rights Congress was, it's characterized as a communist front group. It was a group headed by communists that collected and funded campaigns and raised legal funds for African Americans being persecuted in the South in cases where they couldn't get adequate counsel. They raised funds for labor people who were put in prison for various reasons. And at this time, in this extremely defensive time, this is why I'm going to have to fill in the story a little bit, is that for this particular concert, they were raising funds through the Civil Rights Congress to pay for the legal defense of Communist Party leaders who had been imprisoned under the Smith Act. Paul Robeson actually, and this kind of shows the real shift, because what surprises everyone who's attending this concert, and 15,000 people attend this concert, mostly people who attended these very large Jewish, Black, and other minority and also white people integrated summer camps in upstate New York. What really shocked people was this sea change from 1947, where Paul Robeson held a concert in the exact same place in Peekskill, New York, to 1949. Because in 47, the concert was opposed, but what happened then did not happen in 49. So to kind of briefly summarize what happened in 49 and why this event gets etched on the memory of every person there, it's basically a mass casualty event where no one dies. The American Legion, hardcore right-wing veterans organization, especially at the time, formed after World War I to oppose any unions having strikes, communists, minorities, and especially Jewish communists. The American Legion holds a highly organized march and rally in which they attract people by campaigning for them to come from miles around. So they have about 1,100 people, and people have stories about how these people were all brought there, but some of them include youths in the night, by the time that they're older in the 1960s, saying that, a police officer drove around and said, get in the truck, we're getting some rocks from this quarry, and you're going to throw them at the commies. In a lot of accounts that came out later. And this accords with what is shown on any of the film footage and so on of Peekskill, which is there's these veterans, including uniformed sailors, uniformed soldiers that are members of that American Legion post and American Legion posts around there. And they are lined up on the sides of the road that leads to the concert site, the field where the concert's being held. It's going to be held in an open field, beautiful day in the summer. And they have piles of rocks at the ready to throw at every car and bus that's coming in, mostly from New York City, but also from these kind of summer camps, and to throw them at the communists. And this is where things are really dark. They are rallying for weeks leading up to this. And there's bumper stickers appearing all over Peekskill and Van Cortlandt, Westchester County, that say things like, "Behind the communist, the Jew." People are chanting the N-word repeatedly, "Go back to Russia, you N-word." And the most common bumper sticker is "Wake up America, Peekskill did," which is very reminiscent, I'm sure you realize, of, Deutschland Erwacht. Wake up Germany, the old Nazi chant. And just in case that people weren't getting the message, the night before the first concert, some people in this kind of rabid right-wing crowd had erected a giant cross on the hill overlooking the concert site and ignited. So there's a burning cross leading to that. And the first concert's canceled until Robeson, saying, no, we're going through with this, we're not going to give in to these people, rallies a number of trade unionists, National Maritime Union members, textile union members, to form a guard to be able to hold this concert. That doesn't stop people from throwing massive amounts of rocks, from pulling, especially the African-American attendees to the concert, out of cars, ripping them out of cars, attempting to beat them to hell. And you might ask, were any of these people doing these things arrested? And the answer is no. It seems like the role of the police and the 400 New York State troopers that were sent by Governor Tom Dewey in this whole event seems to have been to make sure that nobody got killed and becomes a martyr. But as far as injuries, all bets are off. People lost eyes, hands, were severely injured, put into wheelchairs from this concert. 150 people were brutally wounded.
Without arrests, we have no real way of knowing who exactly did what. In the reactionary mob, we have no way of knowing to what extent the American Legion organizers had contacts and people in the crowd from other right-wing organizations. We do know, when I read about Peekskill, and again, leading up to recording this episode, what I found myself thinking about a lot was the Unite the Right violence in Charlottesville in 2017, and the way it became this generational touchstone, somewhat for the far right, but especially for the left. Like Isaac said, it was etched on the memory of everyone who was involved there. It comes up a lot in the literature describing this time, including Dr. Rao's Book of Daniel. From the sort of right side of the road, although in an ambivalent sort of way, Isaac and I have a shared interest in the writing of James Ellroy, the grand old man currently of American crime writing. One of his sort of leftist femme fatale characters in the Underworld USA trilogy has a knife scar on her arm that she said she got from an American Legion man at Peekskill. So it imprinted itself on the memory pretty well, and the fact that it's not more well known today, I think, is unfortunate.
It's bizarre. You have multiple kind of attendees like Pete Seeger and others who had rocks thrown through the window, eyes cut with glass and so on, who took these rocks almost as like a kind of sacred object of like, we resist and we survive. And Pete Seeger put one of them, or several of them, into a chimney of his house to kind of build it. And I feel like it's kind of forgotten today because it doesn't fit the teleological narrative.
Right.
Even though they survived and they had this concert and everything like that, what happens is a transformation in which they did not win. And while the event kind of shows this solidarity of labor unionists and communist organizers and
the civil rights
civil rights movement, this kind of broad solidarity of we're all walking along the same road, that is forcibly broken up.
And it also shows that popular anti-communism in America, it's not down to, we disagree with Marx's concept of economic calculation. We disagree with the possibilities of unfreedom that come with the Leninist organizing model. It comes from rank bigotry. It comes from hatred.
Every attendee of this concert said that basically that they saw that in their view, the U.S. was becoming fascist. There was a fascist beachhead that had been put there. And it couldn't be any more clear in light of the fact that several of the crowds that were throwing rocks were chanting things like, "We're Hitler's boys, here to finish the job. We're Hitler's boys, here to finish the job."
So it's weird out there, folks.
Yeah. So essentially, by the time you get to the Peekskill riot, which, to be clear, there's no evidence that any of our cast of characters attended, went to this concert.
Too
by
busy
the time,
at the machine shop.
Too busy at the machine shop and just getting by, man. In spite of the neo-doctrinalist portrayal in the Book of Daniel, where he kind of wants them to be there. It's a touchstone point where you can see that we've come a far, far, long way from 1946. Like, there is no more attempting to ignite the fire. It has consumed the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, in a place like Peekskill, where the recession of 48 and 49 had hit pretty hard, unemployment nationally was just under 8%, but in Peekskill, their major industries had closed down. The communist CIO union people who were to blame for inflation and locking up the economy and ruining business made a very, very convenient target.
Mm-hmm.
Are you an American communist? Just let me finish the point. I'll answer that question. Now, in Scandinavia today, they have decided to solve these problems of all the resources of the nation being in the hands of a few people by cooperative methods. That is, the General Electric, which controls electricity in this country, they more or less put them out of Sweden by cooperative means. In England today, they've taken over the railroads, coal, banks, by socialist means. That is, by public ownership. Now, this oughtn't be any mystery to the American people. We have TVA. This is a part of the struggle of people to get control of some of the wealth instead of leaving it in the hands of a few. I see communism as nothing but an extension of great public ownership of the main means of resources, like the railroad workers said the other day. The coal mines, if they're that important, Senator, to the United States, that every time there's a national emergency, this is life or death to the American people. Doesn't it occur to you that instead of beating the workers on the head, that maybe the government should own the railroads and the coal mines? Well, this is a whole struggle of which communism is a part.
There's a group of young boys here yelling at the people stopped in their cars. There are hundreds and hundreds of people here. If there's a serious outbreak, it will be very bad.
Fighting the cops. Oh, this is terrible. And they are beating up a Negro. They're clubbing him.
In 48, what we see from Vasilyev's notebooks is that the Soviet Union, the Soviet kind of spy apparatus is actually getting like pretty frantic and scared. They say in one entry that the Alpinists, which is the Americans, concealing of the atomic bomb from us shows their intention to use it against us and their ultimate plan to use it against us. So just to kind of go off your point earlier about how this historiography shows a conservative Soviet Union, what we're seeing now is rather than the image that the US has, which is they're being neutral, not trying to conquer the world and so on, but the Soviets are, the Soviets have shut down their entire spy apparatus until they think they can do no more because of US aggression. Their whole attitude is frantic and scared. Mm-hmm. And it's in that environment that in May of 1948, they actually contact Julius again and reach out to him, and he reaches out to David. And there's kind of two separate alleged capers that they get into in this post-war period. It's used by conservative historians to say, Julius wasn't just spying during World War II. He was spying when everyone knew that Russia was our enemy. Mm-hmm. And I think for reasons that should be apparent, by 46 and 47, when the US is no longer prosecuting Nazis who killed American prisoners of war and not prosecuting people like Burton Wheeler, but are prosecuting communists, that paranoid or not, a lot of communists felt like, and people tangentially involved with the communist movement felt like the US is going fascist in this kind of weird way. And for Julius, though, one thing that we do know that he was involved in was after he could no longer keep David on his payroll at the machine shop and has to shut down, he keeps contact with David, and David goes to work at a place called the Arma tank plant, where David volunteered to take pictures inside the plant for the Soviets of this kind of specialized stabilizing thing on the tank that would keep the barrel tracking the target even while the tank is moving, thereby provide a more accurate shot. So we know that at least Julius and David volunteered to do this. We don't know what came of it. The other kind of caper that's alleged is actually in 1948, where later on an informer named Jerome Tartiko says that Julius and others, and the others kind of shift from time to time, went through a marathon session where they photographed plans or manuals of material, classified materials that have been checked out by Julius's friend William Pearl. And I remain, even at this time, a little agnostic on how this happened and whether this happened.
Right, and what sort of materials were they alleged to be?
So the main backing that this did happen comes from, in 2011, Morton Sobel, in an interview with a guy named Stephen Usden, admitted that they did photograph manuals and material from an experimental aircraft field in Langley, Virginia. But Sobel's confession, it's important to note, if you match it against Tardigo's confession, they don't line up. They describe different people being at this place. In Tardigo's confession, Sobel is not there at all. And it's kind of hard for him to have been there. And the FBI forensically examined the documents that were received by William Pearl, who's the guy that supposedly supplied them, and concluded that none of the fingerprints on them matched any of the people that they were looking at. Didn't match Julius, didn't match Pearl, didn't match Michael Sidorovich, a bunch of other people. So you're kind of left with no forensic evidence that shows that any of this happened, and two stories that don't match up. But Sobel says it happened. Maybe it did. Maybe they did take pictures of these jet plane materials. I don't know.
Well, by 1949, when the Soviets build their atomic bomb, or test it rather, breaking the US's nuclear monopoly, becoming the second nuclear armed power in the world. And this presumably chilled everyone out, right? They were just like, it's fine. Now there's now we're even, equals pequals, right?
Yeah, I mean, everyone who wanted to have a war with the Soviet Union just was like, well, no, it's fine. Good situation.
Yeah.
No. In 1949, when the U.S. gets kind of surreptitious confirmation through readings on radiation and trace elements that are in the air that the Soviet Union has certainly tested an atomic bomb, because the Soviet Union didn't announce that they did it at the time, there is a wave of panic. And even though in 1946 you had scientists who said, of course the Soviet Union would be seeking this material, there was kind of a denial in the American defense establishment that they could ever achieve it, because Soviet Union has a socialist system.
Right.
And also they're stupid Asiatics and every other
Slavs,
thing. And so there's kind of an immediate search for how this could have happened. And of course, there's the finger pointing towards people like Alan Nunn May. And then there's a renewed search for spies. And I'm not going to put too fine a point on this, but there is a kernel of a similarity in this search for spies and espionage as to why the Soviets have the atomic bomb, why the thing that has been declared by the government the enemy for the past 5 years is now suddenly kind of winning, past 4 years is suddenly kind of winning, it's a little bit of a stab in the back explanation, right? The Soviets couldn't have done this on their own. Right. They're not worthy adversaries. We're getting stabbed in the back by some espionage. Yeah. It happened before.
It's a classic reactionary thing where their enemies are both inferior and helpless, incompetence, but at the same time they're scary and can do these massive feats that would be hard to imagine themselves doing. And usually the way they square that circle is it's betrayal, it's treason, it's a stab in the back, and the stab in the back usually comes from a group of people that we've decided are inherently untrustworthy, which often enough turns out to be the Jews.
Yeah. Minorities with supposed dual allegiances and so on.
Right.
But the first kind of break in finding more spies, not just Alan Nunn May, because they knew that couldn't have been enough, even though he passed along two different samples of uranium-238 and 235, it was 235 and 233, I think, is actually not in the United States, it's in the United Kingdom, where Klaus Fuchs, the man who did it, the super spy who actually can write equations on a piece of paper and actually give them to a Soviet source, unlike David Greenglass. He is being surveilled and interviewed repeatedly by members of MI5. And an MI5 agent who is talking to him or they had kind of a lunch or a break together one day, who's talking to him, tries to kind of make a play for making him confess. So MI5 and the American Federal Bureau of Investigation have very good reason at this point for thinking that Klaus Fuchs is a Soviet spy with the code name Charles. And the reason they think this is that there was a paper passed along, according to their decrypted communications under Venona, about gaseous diffusion as a way of separating the isotope of uranium that you need for an atomic bomb and actually making. In other words, a paper on the scientific method of how to make this component for a Hiroshima-type bomb, uranium bomb. And Klaus Fuchs was the author of that paper. This led them to suspect him even more because in one of the kind of couriers that was pointed out by Gouzenko in 1946, they actually found Klaus Fuchs's number in one of his notebooks. They're like, how the hell did this guy get Klaus Fuchs's phone number or address? Can't remember which. So at first, this MI5 agent plays the Gouzenko card. He knows he can't say like, oh yeah, by the way, the Americans have decrypted KGB communications. We found out that you're dead to rights. So he plays this card. Klaus Fuchs denies it. And then he plays the card that works more often than any of that, TV detective stuff, which is, don't you just want to get this off your conscience?
Yeah. Aren't you sick of talking to me? Yeah.
And Klaus Fuchs apparently takes a deep breath, says yeah, and gives them details of activities that he was involved in. But Klaus Fuchs also took measures to try not to implicate, as far as possible, other people. He was arrested, he was put in jail, and he was put through several interviews about when he was in the United States, who was picking up the papers or materials that he had written for the Soviets and taking them to a Soviet agent. He wasn't doing that himself. And he only knew this courier as Raymond. So after Klaus Fuchs confesses, the search is on for the FBI to find out who Raymond is. They have clues from Venona, but it's important to note that the FBI agents don't actually know that Venona is Venona. The only information that's passed down to them is stuff like, we have a really good informant, we're going to call it like T7 or whatever. The informant says this, and it's an interpretation of a Venona cable. So they're like getting like way down on like the children's version of telephone as to what's going on. They then are able to search for Raymond based on a few characteristics that have been described, and they finally close in on the guy we talked about briefly in episode 1, the Philadelphia chemist and compulsive liar, Harry Gold. They physically surveil Harry Gold, they take pictures of him, they have film of him, and they start kind of putting the characteristics together from various Venona decrypts that Harry Gold is the guy. In one interrogation of Klaus Fuchs, because they're bringing this information back to him, like the film of Harry Gold, the photographs, stuff like that, and they ask him to identify Harry Gold as the courier, or if he is the man. And according to their account, and there was a little bit of dispute about this, I see no reason actually at this point for doubting their account, because Harry Gold really was a courier. We know he was Arno, according to the Soviet codenames. Fuchs admits that Harry Gold is the guy. If I had to guess why there's so much controversy about this, I would guess probably that Fuchs finally just like nodded or gave like a passive admission, and that was enough for them to know on scene. But it's not like Fuchs wrote out like, this is the man, I identified him out of a lineup or anything like that. They're just like, this is the guy, right?
So who raises controversy that Harry Gold is a courier?
Well, later when people are kind of challenging the narrative of the trial, because Harry Gold, as we know, just makes up stuff all the time.
So perhaps, I guess we'll get into that later then, when we get into sort of the legacy of the trial.
Harry Gold, in Miriam Moskowitz's words, a woman who was implicated by him and knew him very well, was a sad sack. His thing that he was concerned about was he took care of his ailing father, he took care of his family. How was he going to support them if he was put in prison? What was he going to do other than cooperate? He couldn't afford much of a lawyer. And he did get a lawyer. It was provided to him. And Harry Gold himself confesses, although the confessions themselves are kind of a combination of truth and confabulation. But the crucial thing for our story here at this point is not him implicating his friend and co-workers, Miriam Moskowitz or Abe Rothman or anything like that. That's a whole other story. It's that he said that at one point in his courier job as a NKGB courier, he says to the FBI, he traveled to New Mexico and met with someone who is not a scientist, whose proper, well, he ultimately says, oh yeah, it was I remember, it's Greenglass. But no, whose proper name he didn't know, but he could describe him as a GI, a uniformed soldier of the United States military, and therefore probably a member of the Special Engineering Detachment, which David Greenglass was. And further, a couple of characteristics about him. He said he was probably from New York, Brooklyn, Bronx, something like that. That he thought he was Jewish, which obviously these buttoned up WASP and other FBI agents, all legally trained, probably wrote down Jewish over and over again. Got him.
Yeah.
And roughly where he thought he met him. He kind of just tried to describe the house that he met him in, which was ultimately the rooming house that David Greenglass and Ruth Greenglass were renting out. After receiving this and trying to do some background on which Los Alamos Special Engineering Detachment soldiers it could have been, the FBI kind of couples this description with a few descriptions that they think are from informants or reliable sources, which are actually Venona decryptions of Soviet cables about their agents, and says that the unknown subject is almost certainly David Greenglass. And then they begin surveilling David Greenglass like crazy. At one point, he notices that there is a truck that's marked like, God, they have the originality of like Looney Tunes. I think it was marked Acme Shipping.
Very nice. Classic.
It was Acme something.
That's great.
And David Greenglass looks at this truck and turns to Ruth Greenglass and he's like, is there an Acme? Because Julius had already informed him that, you know, with Klaus Fuchs having confessed and this being in the newspapers, that he is hot.
Right.
He is potentially going to be arrested.
Yeah. So just to make clear for the reader the line of transmission here. So we have Klaus Fuchs, who actually did have access to the real ability to pass on serious atomic
secrets. Not just access to papers or something like that. Klaus Fuchs was doing it.
Yeah.
Like, he was the one writing the calculations for the implosion.
Right, yeah. And who actually understood a little bit more of both the science and seems a somewhat smarter spy. He was where he would have been in New York or in Los Alamos, or where would he have been when he was communicating with Harry Gold?
So I'm trying to remember this exactly, but at one point, at two important points, he passes off materials to Harry Gold at Los Alamos.
Okay.
Or not in Los Alamos proper, obviously, but in Santa Fe.
Right, Santa Fe or wherever else. So he's connected to Gold, then Gold is the go-between, taking these secrets, giving them to a GI that they later figure out either definitely or probably as David Greenglass.
Yes.
Greenglass then transfers them to Julius. Julius transfers them to Soviet agents. Is that more or less what's being alleged here, or what actually happened?
Well, what we know actually happened was that information was not being routed through, as we remember from our last episode, information was not being routed from Greenglass to Julius, the Soviet agent. Klaus Fuchs was on one track routing information from him to Harry Gold to Soviet agent, and then on a parallel track, without them knowing about each other, it was Greenglass to Harry Gold to Soviet agent.
Yes.
So Harry Gold acted as the handler for these two, but totally separately.
Yes. Well, that doesn't seem like very good operational security for them, but what can you do?
As you can imagine, the moment that Klaus Fuchs confessed and then Harry Gold is arrested, the Soviets are very panicked about what's going to happen in the next link in the chain. Some of their writing at this time. It's worth noting that before the FBI is seeming to be, appearing to be really on to David Greenglass, they already have suspicions about him in relation to not espionage, but stealing materials out of Los Alamos, which might be related to espionage and might not.
He might have just been stealing them to sell or something.
Yeah, and in fact, it's worth pointing out at this point that David Greenglass may have actually been stealing stuff out of Los Alamos not related to espionage.
Right.
When Molitor and Miriam Schneer finally got access to his bank records that the FBI had taken at the time for the investigation, they found out that he and Ruth had made deposits that were equivalent at this time about $2,200 in unaccounted for income, despite the fact that he admitted only that Harry Gold had given him payment of about $500. So that other...
So he might have also been taking stuff off the back of the truck, selling it to whoever.
Exactly. And, you know, even he even talked to Sam Roberts about how he and other, you know, friends in the Special Engineering Division were kind of like retrofitting radios and stuff like that. You can imagine in the wartime rationing environment outside of Los Alamos, where people are having to use ration books for different meats and for fuel, tires. But there's an extensive black market, one would think, inside of a place where nothing is, they attempt to ration nothing. As far as possible to keep the scientists and everyone on board happy dandy.
Interesting.
So I think there's a lot of plausibility.
So it converges between their investigating his potentially having stolen materials for espionage purposes or not from Los Alamos, with what they've learned from Venona or just from Harry Gold.
I believe both at this point, but I'm going to retcon and correct that. Yes, and Harry Gold.
Yes, okay, great. Good.
But by February of 1950, when, you know, this whole anti-communist hysteria is in full effect, 2 FBI agents come by David Greenglass's apartment, Greenglass, which is still a cold water flat, no heater, no dreams of post-war real prosperity having come true at all. He's interviewed by 2 FBI agents who say, you know, we're investigating a uranium theft. And he does report this to Julius, who reports to the Soviets, or he reports to the Soviets himself, because they say in the last days of January, American counterintelligence agents called David Greenglass, codename Caliber, at work and later came by his apartment and asked him 3 questions under the pretext of a previous uranium theft at Los Alamos. They asked him, did David Greenglass have the opportunity to see uranium while working at the Los Alamos laboratory? Did he know anyone who took or tried to take uranium? Did he take uranium? And of course, the thing that they probably knew was that he totally did. He took uranium and plutonium, and we actually have a little entry in Vasilyev's notebooks where he had passed along a sample of uranium-238 to a Soviet handler, and it's sent to eventually Moscow. But this, understandably, has the entire network spooked. And it's worth noting that with all of the business troubles and everything that happened at the machine shop during these years of not prosperity, David and Julius aren't actually on the best of terms at all. At one point, Bernie Greenglass, David's brother, had to break up a fight between them because David Greenglass put some of his own money into the machine shop, which he's working for, and it seems to be kind of lost. During these years, David has been kind of hitting up Julius for money for various things as he's trying to support his kids, trying to support his wife, things really hit the low point, though, for David, when one night his wife, in this unheated, no real heating furnace apartment on the Lower East Side, gets up and her flannel nightgown catches on the stove that they use, this kind of oven stove combination they use to heat the apartment at night, and catches on fire. And Ruth Greenglass then has first, second, and third degree burns. She's sent to the hospital. She has O-negative blood. And at that time, it was extremely hard for anyone to be able to even get that. So David actually made an appeal on the radio himself to try to get someone to donate enough blood to save his wife's life. So it's at this critical point when the failure of any kind of bigger New Deal or expanded post-war socialization of the economy that they all thought was going to happen.
Right, even Truman wanted to get single-payer health care. And was blocked.
It's just crashing up against the wall of anti-communists.
Yeah.
It's in that environment that David isn't able to really improve his situation, and he's confronted by 2 FBI agents while his wife actually is later on still in the hospital. Those first, second, and third degree burns having become terribly infected. And she has open wounds on her abdomen. It's there that the FBI, now knowing, like we said, or being pretty sure that this Soviet codename Caliber is David Greenglass, that they confront him as he's making a formula for his baby with his wife in the hospital, begin interrogating him at their station. I believe they interrogated him at the Foley Square FBI headquarters for that New York office. Now, in the later trial accounts, this interrogation becomes something like they confront David Greenglass with the fact that Harry Gold says that he is the GI that he saw.
Which never happened.
No, not at that time. Eventually, Harry Gold did identify him, Harry Gold being a very cooperative witness at this point. But at that time, when they interrogate him, they say, Harry Gold identify you. And according to their account, David Greenglass kind of throws up his hand and starts telling him the story of his involvement. I read this very differently, and I'm going to actually read some extent, not the whole thing, from David Greenglass's June 15th, 1950 statement when this arrest happens in the summer of 1950. His wife in the hospital, suffering from open abdominal wounds and everything else. David really strikes me as the type of guy when he gets arrested who believes that he can outsmart his way out of the situation by giving a convincing a story that kind of exculpates him, but doesn't realize that in the course of saying anything about himself, of saying anything to the police officers or FBI agents in this case, he's giving them more pieces of a puzzle that they are already solving.
Just don't talk, folks. Don't talk. No one talks. Everyone walks.
But in his case, you get the sense that he believes he can outsmart his way out of the story. And he gives an ambiguous story. And so he says things like, about 1945, my wife moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico from New York City. 3 or 4 months later, she had a miscarriage. Approximately a month after that time, a man came to a place where Ruth was living, 209 North High Street, Albuquerque, New Mexico. I did not know this man's name, but recently recognized in pictures in newspapers as being Harry Gold. He had with him a torn piece of paper card, which fitted a torn piece of paper card furnished to me as a means of identifying this man. I cannot recall at this time whether this torn piece of card was given to me by my wife, Ruth, who at the time moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico from New York, or whether I received it from Julius Rosenberg while I was in New York City. Moving on. He, meaning Harry Gold, gave me an envelope containing $500. He also kind of plays ambivalent on whether he gave him any information related to the atomic bomb. I have furnished a rough pencil sketch of a portion of a above-mentioned high-explosive implosion test to FBI agents, which is the information that he says that he gave at that time. There's no mention, it should be known here, in this entire first interrogation that Julius and Ethel as a team convinced his wife to do this, that Ethel typed any notes, that Julius met with David Greenglass in September of that year and took all this information and said, it's very good, I'm giving it to my Soviet agent. None of that.
It was just the possibility that maybe he got the card, the half of the card from Julius and handed over the information.
Right. And
if it wasn't actually what he just did with his wife, with the other possibility. He couldn't remember.
Yeah. In his efforts to kind of explain away how Harry Gold knows him and everything else, kind of outsmart his way out of the situation, he first implicates his own wife, who's in the hospital. Which is not what he wants to do. You can kind of see how in this process he begins panic backpedaling. And then Ruth is kind of interviewed in the hospital, and Ruth, by this time, we saw her as kind of like a more idealistic woman going to rallies with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, volunteering her apartment to be a kind of safe house for photographing documents. By this time, she is a very hardened customer, and the FBI comes to her and she says, "What did David say?" I'm not talking to you until I talk to a lawyer, which is exactly what David should have said if he wanted to save his own skin.
Exactly what anyone should say.
Julius is arrested 2 days later after David gives 2 more statements that vary in they're facts, but just implicate Julius more and more and get him deeper and deeper in this mess. Julius is brought in by the FBI, and in his initial interview, he says, David said, what? Well, then basically, why don't you bring him in here? He can say it to my face. And I think that part of this attitude, even though Julius at that time was a full-on NKGB, that time evolving into KGB agent, was, well, this is crap. I didn't do half of this stuff that David's saying, so no, I don't believe these guys. Bring in David to say it.
Right.
And he'll probably get the message that you should shut the hell up.
Yeah.
After he's interviewed, in this initial interview, he calls up a lawyer. I believe
Who's he? Julius?
Julius calls up a lawyer and says, the FBI's confronted me. What should I do? Said, well, the lawyer says, we'll ask them if you're under arrest. He does. He said, well, they said I'm not under arrest. They're like, then go.
Yeah.
Get out of there. Which he does. But by this point, David has implicated Julius far, far too much. The FBI rearrests him. It's interesting that in this entire chain of people, the first people to not turn tail and talk, really, are Julius and Ethel. But for his part, David, having initially panicked and giving this statement to the FBI agents, does kind of regain his composure and call up a lawyer, Ojan Raghi, who is that former prosecutor. Ojan Raghi, though, wasn't just like a liberal at the time. He actually was very, very prominent in campaigning for Henry Wallace. He had been kind of this fellow traveler liked among American Labor Party and Progressive Party circles for this kind of hardline anti-Nazi and world peace stance. However, he'd already begun evolving at this time to the point, evolving, I guess, in quotes, where he no longer trusted the Soviet Union in any way. And he was actually a paid lobbyist for Tito's Yugoslavia.
Oh, interesting. The Titoists strike again.
So you might be asking yourself, what money did David have to hire a lawyer with? And for years, this was kind of a point of debate because David did have something like $4,000 stashed away with his brother, not Bernie Greenglass, but Louis Abel, his other brother. And he had preemptively given him that $4,000 that was charged in kind of a conjecture way that this $4,000 may have just been the result of more of David's kind of peddling activities and been stashed away for a rainy day. It's now clear from Vasilyev's notebooks that this money was part of a $5,000 drop that was given by Julius to David from the Soviets.
At what time?
Basically in the months before he was arrested.
Interesting.
In the months before he was arrested, Julius, whose relationship with David had completely broken down, David had come demanding the money that he invested in the business back several times, was still obviously sympathetic towards his brother-in-law. And you can see kind of conveyed in the entries in Vasilyev's notebooks that Julius is essentially pleading for more time because the KGB has already told him that now with Harry Gold exposed, you need to get your brother out of the country. He's caliber. He was at Los Alamos. He's white hot.
Yeah. Your brother-in-law.
Your brother-in-law, exactly.
Yeah.
He's going to be arrested if he stays around much longer. Julius brings up what David has apparently told him, which is David says that he has $3,000 in debt, which is a lot for the time.
Right.
And needs to be able to pay that off before evacuating his wife out. And furthermore, that his wife is suffering from these open abdominal wounds, 2 of them on her belly, as she's recovering from these 3rd-degree burns from this fucking furnace. And the Soviets initially agreed. They provide him half of a $10,000 payment via Julius, tell him to make passport photos. But the thing that David does next, the most odd part about it, is that rather than taking this money and then going forward with the plans that are laid out, that he's to go to Mexico, and then from Mexico to go to Sweden, and then Czechoslovakia, and then maybe the Soviet Union after that, is he pays off his debts and he takes Ruth out to the Catskills. And in a later interview about how he was captured, they asked David, why did you go to the Catskills? Like, why didn't you just run and go to Czechoslovakia? He's like, I was never going to go to Czechoslovakia. I didn't want to go live out there. That's silly. I'm a bit skeptical of this account. I think that what maybe David was really up to here is that Ruth wasn't ready to move.
Right.
And so he initially went to the Catskills, where the FBI ultimately captured him, even though he said he knew the Catskills like the back of his hand, there's no way they could capture him.
Right, yeah, they couldn't, survey the various, Borscht Belt hotels and campsites.
No way.
He was going to go.
Hidden, camouflage.
Yeah, he was going to go Davy Crockett in the woods.
Live a life on his own.
Yeah.
But with David captured, he talks with a lawyer from O. John Rogue's office. This lawyer initially just basically asked him, okay, like, what did you tell the FBI? In other words, how deep are you dug in this hole already?
Mm-hmm.
And when the lawyer walked in, David said something to the effect of, don't worry, I'll deny everything and say they forced me to say it.
Mm-hmm.
At which point the lawyer says, you mean a signed confession?
Yeah.
which we're looking at now.
Right, yeah, that's literally in front of you.
Yeah. And at least from the sheets that the FBI put up, they interrogated David, they braced him for 4 hours before he confessed into everything. And a stenographer was brought in and began to sign the statement.
Mm-hmm.
As Michael Mirapol and others have pointed out, we don't really know what the FBI fed David.
Right.
And would feed him in the coming days. Because it's not a recorded interrogation. No one was running a tape or anything like that. It was just talk until you get this guy to admit what you need to admit, and then have him write it down.
Yeah.
So with David having admitted at least that he had passed along atomic materials, or maybe did, the next step in the chain for the FBI was, if David is caliber, we know that Julius is liberal. From the Venona decrypts, we know that he's the handler, and we need David to start talking about Julius. These FBI agents who know that about Julius, or think they know that about Julius, I mean, they do. David can read the room. He's streetwise enough about people, even though he might be a complete putz about himself, to know what they're after. And you can't envy the position that he's in. If he goes in, his wife, Ruth, has no means to provide at all. She's injured. She hasn't been at her clerical job. She's been driven, like a lot of women, well out of the workforce for a long time. His family's impoverished. Kids are still living in the cold water flat. And these FBI agents are telling him exactly what they want to hear. At least that's the way it seems from what they keep getting out of one statement after another, after another, after another. Ruth, interviewed by O. John Rogue, talks about whether they should cooperate or whether David should basically recant his confession, say that he was forced to make it, and then deny everything completely. And this is probably the pivotal moment here. O. John Rogue says, you two are already in it. You should cooperate to the fullest extent, and basically walks them like sheep to the FBI.
Wow.
And what kind of evolves here in their relationship with David, who's arrested and held at the Tombs and held in jail, including at one point with Harry Gold, not his cellmate, but in the same jail, is that he's inside, and at least he can tell himself, in his view, that he's inside, but the FBI is not going to put his wife inside.
Right.
As long as he cooperates. And that, as far as we can tell, was the deal. There's a very colorful description of an interrogation at one point where, and I am paraphrasing a bit, don't come at me on this, but David says something to the effect of, if you touch Ruth in any way, I'll kill myself and then you'll have nothing.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so essentially between sort of his own situation, the FBI, and especially Rogie or Rog, he can frame this story for himself, whereby completely submitting to the FBI, telling them everything, including just whatever he thinks they might want to hear, that he is saving his wife.
Yeah. And
there's no other way.
And there
no other
is,
options.
And it's important to say here, though, there is an extent in which David really did hold back.
Okay.
Right? David doesn't say anything to the FBI about how he passed along information to the Soviets in September of 1945. Right. He doesn't say anything about passing along information materials in December of 1945.
Right. But he knows he has to throw them someone.
Yeah, and he knows exactly who the someone they want is. It's Julius.
Yeah.
He mentioned Julius from the go, it's important to say. Mm-hmm. But in his original confessions, it doesn't appear that Julius is that much of a paymaster or a puppet master or anything. It's kind of just David and Julius and Ruth doing this on their own. But there's a point in which these interrogations are not just forced, but that David kind of embraces his captivity in a way. He takes on the role of cooperator with a kind of like gusto.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like that's something that happens sometimes.
And yeah, Ruth Greenglass had said there's a point in which you begin to build a relationship with these people, because the FBI just when you become this cooperator, you're no longer this person they're trying to grill and break, right? You're a person who, listen, we know you want to come clean. We just wanted you to clarify some details. Like, are you sure you don't remember this?
Yeah.
Are you sure you don't remember that? It's in these early interrogations that David is pretty plain with Ojan Rog, his lawyer, that he tells the FBI stuff that he doesn't remember because it's what they wanted to hear.
Right.
And Rog wrote that down.
So then they pick up Julius.
They pick up Julius, and Julius steadfastly denies everything David says. Important to note at this time that while Ojan Rog came in and helped David, it was very, very hard for any accused communist to get a lawyer. And there's a very, very good reason for that. And I'll go into this, I think, when we talk about the trial.
Right.
But any lawyer who raised too much of a fuss in a courtroom in some prosecution of a communist at this point in time was liable to be thrown in jail for contempt of court.
Wow.
Or, if not thrown in jail for contempt of court because the judge didn't want to kind of face that on appeal, they did face disciplinary proceedings from bar associations that were in charge of whether they could practice law at all. There's a very famous case of a woman named Helen Buzak who wasn't actually on a case. She was just a lawyer commenting about the trial of 7 people in Hawaii under trumped up charges. It's called the Hawaii 7 trial. And she said, this is a frame up, these are trumped up charges. And just for saying that, her bar association brought proceedings against her and suspended her license.
So was this situation, this anti-communist paranoia, extending to really compromising the institutions that we, in theory, take for granted to protect civil liberties from they're thoroughly compromised. If anything, they're turned against potential political dissidents.
Absolutely.
That's the arena that Julius finds himself in, opposed to his brother-in-law in a courtroom in New York in 1950. So that's where we'll wind up next time.